everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to our monthly La Mesita webinar. This is part 2 of the webinar we did back in June. No, in May. And entitled Go Back to Your Country, Discussions on Discrimination to Build Resilience in the Latinx Community, presented by Dr. Gabriela Livas-Stein. So just a few housekeeping items. Want to welcome you all. Want to encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to keep your video turned on. It helps us to connect during this time that we're all living in Zoom. And it helps us as presenters to get those reactions since we don't have an audience today. So if you feel comfortable, please do that. And then there'll be times during the presentation and we'll have a Q&A towards the end where we'll invite you to unmute and share questions and opinions and comments. So hope that you will jump in during today's session. We are providing continuing education credits through Greensboro AHEC, so a big thank you to them for coordinating that for us. At this point, you would have needed to register by yesterday to get those, but we have these webinars every month. They're going for an hour and a half now instead of an hour, and we're providing credit accordingly. So if you didn't get it this time, just make sure to register with Greensboro AHEC ahead of the next one next month. And I want to take a second to invite everyone. We have a survey that we've developed. We're trying to advocate with policymakers to help with funding and responding to the discrepant impact that COVID has had on the Latinx community. So if you can take about 5 minutes, Sophia is putting this link in the chat for you all. So either hopefully just save it for after the presentation, but if you have time after today to just take some time to fill out this survey, it'll help us in terms of advocating for the programming that La Mesita is doing to try to respond to how the Latinx population is being impacted by COVID. So with that, I'm going to introduce our presenter today. So Gabriela Livas-Stein, hopefully, I think at this point she's spread across so much of our programming, and we're so grateful for her support of La Mesita. But she is an associate professor of clinical psychology within the Department of Clinical Psychology at UNCG. Her research really focuses on understanding protective factors for Latino and ethnic minority youth as they adapt to life in the United States. She was my mentor, and pretty much what I know I've learned from her and the studies she's put in front of me and books over the years. She's also the Vice President of Programming for SRCD, Society and Research on Adolescence. So without further ado, Gabby, I'll turn it over to you. So I'll stop sharing and you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, let's see if this works. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you via web. So thank you so much for coming and hearing again. So let's see if I can get this to work the right way. Hopefully I will. So give me just 1 second to get this set up. To be full screen, we can do it. Okay, is it working okay?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. So thank you again for joining me, and thank you, Juan, for the kind introduction and for all the work that everyone's doing out there supporting the community right now. Since we last spoke last time, there's been a huge change, a huge sort of change in terms of how people are understanding social justice issues and discrimination more broadly. So when Juan sort of suggested us continuing this conversation, I really felt that it would be important to touch on some of the issues that people brought up, but also how sort of it intersects with our current sort of crisis in terms of how people are thinking around both COVID-19 and discrimination in that regard, but also around Black Lives Matter and sort of social movements for social justice and policing in our society. And I would like to start by just taking just a quick, just 30-second sort of moment of silence to honor sort of all the folks that have been suffering from police brutality, who've been suffering from brutality by different sort of federal agents that are targeting communities, as well as the folks that have perished and are suffering from the COVID-19. So if we could just take just 30 seconds, if that would be okay with everyone, because I think it's important to honor what's happening in our society. Okay, thank you for doing that, everyone. So, so one of the things that we wanted to start is for those of you who joined us a few months ago, wanted to sort of think, or just how often have you had discussions about discrimination in your work with Latinx youth and families in the last sort of 3 months that we've been working? So there's a poll up, I think. Juan, is it up? There it is. So just let us know how much this has been coming up for everyone in terms of the work that you're doing right now.
I think we can go ahead and publish.
So it seems like for folks, this is something that's coming up a lot. You've been talking about it somewhat often or very often. I think really shows, I think in part because of what's happening in sort of our society more broadly and the awareness that there is about some of the structural and systemic barriers that exist for communities of color, particularly for Latinx communities, and then the social justice movements that are really, you know, clearly sort of taken over sort of the social conversation, I think has really impacted that. So what we wanted to start by talking about just different things about discrimination in the Latinx community that we hadn't touched or had time to talk to about as much last time. And one thing that had come up a lot was sort of the notion of colorism. And this, I think, really intersects nicely with what we're thinking through and the sort of social movements that we have right now. So some folks had brought this up at the end of the webinar last time as something they wanted to touch on, which is really important. So colorism, for those of you who are less aware, I know that some of us are really aware of this topic, but some are less aware, is really sort of the privileging of whiteness that occurs in different societies, and sort of the privileging that has really been sort of embedded in colonialism for the Latinx community more broadly. So if you think, I think this is from this great article by Chavizueña and all. I'm happy to share the article, and you can read a lot sort of about the history of colorism in the Latinx community. But what you hear I'm presenting is this pyramid, thinking around the Latin American social caste and sort of where did people sort of fit in, right? So this notion in the Latinx community broadly is that sort of this mestizo culture, mestizaje, or sort of this mix that the Latinx group doesn't have a relevant racial group, but instead is a mix of all of these different sort of European, indigenous, African identities and racial groups that have come together. But really part of that obscures or really tries to hide this caste system that has existed historically in the society that really, as you can see at the very top, privileges the Spaniards or the phenotypically white individuals that were born in Spain, right? Those are the folks that had the most social power. And then you can see as you go down, there's almost like, you can see the increasing sort of level of sort of social disadvantage that different groups faced. For example, those that were white but born in the Americas versus mestizos, which were European and indigenous ancestries, mulattoes who were mixed European and African ancestries, Zambos, mixed indigenous and African ancestry, and then indigenous and Africans were at the bottom of this social pyramid. And this caste system continues to have impacts on our communities in our countries of origin across Latin America. And for a lot of what's really important to sort of think around is how much our societies continue to privilege whiteness and light skin and white phenotype. And really sort of that there's been, in particularly in lots of Latin American countries, sort of a minimization of the impact of African descendants, as well as sort of acknowledging of the indigenous communities that exist and continue to experience social disadvantage. What happens then, so this sort of caste system, this sort of colorism that exists, then gets sort of continues to have an impact on sort of how folks adjust here in the United States. So research has shown that folks that have darker skin phenotype or more indigenous or Afro-Latinx tend to have more difficulties in the United States in terms of obtaining housing. They have more difficulty getting into the labor market. They're less likely to quote unquote move up the socioeconomic ladder. So, and, a sociological study was done in which they looked at immigrants from Mexico, and they had all controlling all other variables. The only difference was skin tone, the darkness of their skin tone, and folks who were darker skinned were less likely to have obtained sort of, had less income, had less sort of participation in terms of permanent jobs. So there was continued sort of discrimination that was occurring even upon immigration that they may have been experiencing back in their home countries. So it has an impact on educational attainment as well as discrimination. So there's not as much studies that have looked at phenotype in the Latinx community, but the few studies that have done that really document that they're experiencing a lot more contextual risk the more darker skin or phenotype that you show. For example, one thing that we know from a study that was done by Manya Taylor is that they found that racial socialization or having conversations about race and discrimination were most important for kids that were darker skinned and had more indigenous features. And these were Latinx kids in the Midwest. So this is a really sort of important context to think about sort of how the Latinx community sort of lives and sort of experiences discrimination. Not surprisingly, these contextual risks then sort of lead to mental health risks. So a few studies have shown that either darker skinned Latinx folks, so they just ask people about their skin tone, or Afro-Latinx, so specifically people who identify as both having African ancestry and Latinx, have greater sort of mental health risks, again, due to these contextual risks that they're experiencing. So greater depressive symptoms, negative self-perception. In one study with college students, they found that darker skinned Latinas reported feeling less attractive than others and experiencing greater distress. So definitely that these impacts of colorism have a continued sort of impact across time for these folks and lead to psychological distress. And one of the things that's important to think about is sort of how do we see it everywhere? So for example, here's a new show that was in Netflix called Made in Mexico. And as you can see, that almost everyone in this picture looks phenotypically white, looks European ancestry, and sort of that is the notion of what Mexico looks like. Now, I myself am Mexican, and I remember when I first started taking classes on social justice and sort of understanding racial identity, I remember going back to my hometown, which is Monterrey, Mexico, and I remember looking at all the billboards, and I never had realized that every single billboard I saw advertising anything had a white, phenotypically European-looking person in every billboard that I saw. I just counted them, and I was really shocked because this was something that was in part of my society, but I hadn't been aware of. I hadn't been sort of cognizant of, especially myself as a light-skinned Mexican person. It just was in the milieu. You can also see that just even here's the Univision launches their local morning newscast in Texas, and you can really see that this does not reflect the phenotypic diversity of the Latinx community. So the media that we're surrounded by continues to promote sort of colorism, sort of this sort of white beauty standards as being the most important and sort of what we aspire to. You can see that too in terms of who folks think are beautiful. So on the left, we have, many of you maybe watched the Super Bowl this year, and Shakira and J-Lo were the primary presenters, and two very light-skinned, Shakira herself even descendant of not just Colombia, right, has other descendants as well. And they were really hailed, that people were so excited that this was the Latinx community getting a shout out, but again, very typically light-skinned, as opposed to here we see Yalitza Pracio, who was in Roma and was one of the first indigenous folks from Mexico to sort of be nominated for an Oscar and just have received a lot of attention and caused a lot of controversy in Mexico as newscasters were wearing brown face and making fun of her and her indigenous roots. And here you also see a picture of Celia Cruz, who's a famous Cuban singer who, again, also don't get to sort of have that same epitome of beauty. So colorism is in every sort of aspect of the society that we see. And we see it in our clients' lives and in folks' real lives. So we see it in lots of different places, as I said, in sort of the beauty standards and telenovelas and what you're exposed to, conversations about hair texture, who has good hair versus bad hair, with bad hair being hair that's more associated with less sort of European standards or white standards. You see it in family dynamics potentially in terms of who, I remember in just my own family, my sister is darker skinned than I am, and growing up, her nickname, here's the term of endearment, her nickname was Negrita, because she was darker skinned. And I was known as the more blonde one, right, the güera. And if you think around lots of different Latinx cultures, or sort of that's where you're known as sort of these kinds of different things in terms of what then in some families that then leads to who's the attractive one, who's not the attractive one, who's the one that's sort of the favorite child, and these dynamics play a role. In selection of romantic partners, sort of thinking around, are you going to select folks who are darker skinned or lighter skinned? And if you select a romantic partner who's darker skinned, how is that going to then sort of, make your sort of genetic pool less aspiring to this white standards. So it's really, colorism is evident in lots of different sort of ways in everyday life for Latinx folks. And it's something important that as folks that work with the community that we really are aware of, to understand that this comes from this history of sort of internalized oppression and colonialism and white supremacy, and how we can sort of think about fighting it.
Gabby, before you move on, we just have a couple comments.
Sure.
Melissa, Santiago, and Jaylene both say you hear a lot, mejorar la raza.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also reminded just of my own experience. Well, let me let you respond to that point, and then I'll share my personal anecdote.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly in terms of the selection of the romantic partner, that you don't pick someone who's darker skinned, because that's going to then bring you down socially and sort of social status. And so you have to make the la raza, yeah, that and that's in a lot of different cultures in different countries.
And just real quick, I have some of my cousins, they have a large family, and the family has kind of divided between the 6 kids. There's some that are darker skin and some that are lighter skin, and they within their own family describe themselves as the carilindos and the caribeños. So the pretty faces or the Caribbean ones. Mm-hmm. So it's just, immediately there, those associations just are always happening.
Yeah, no, definitely. I was telling, even I was preparing for this talk, I just went to the beach, and my mom came over briefly to drop something off, and she's like, "Ay, qué negra te pusiste." Just from, and that, for those of you who don't speak Spanish, like how Black you look, which, as you can tell, like I'm not very dark skinned. But that was the term. It was like, noticing that your skin tone that was bad, at, avoiding the sun, making yourself as light skinned as possible, because that's sort of associated with the sort of higher social status. So it's something you see in lots of places. So one question we had for you all is, how often has colorism come up in your work with Latinx families and sort of the work that you've done with folks? How often have you seen this?
And as people are responding, Sandra Redis shares, we also do this a lot. We call people Americano if they are white, but negro if he is Black, even if he is an American.
Yeah, that's right. Even just how we label American, which I think is a really important point, because we associate American with whiteness. So some people haven't noticed it at all, but some of the people have really noticed this in terms of the work that they're doing. So it's definitely very prevalent. But I do think those labels really matter about who's privileged in society and who's what society we have to, even like when I was doing research and we really think about we think about when acculturating to American culture, we really mean acculturating to white middle class culture, right? There's lots of different types of American subcultures, lots of different types of American cultures. And so even how you talk about acculturation sort of privileges that white sort of middle class perspective, which I think is an important thing to think through when you're working with clients. And sometimes that leads to some of the tensions, and we'll talk a little bit about in a second, sort of more how that sort of the tensions among different racial groups in here in the United States and across the world. So it's really important to think about. So we had one thing that I think is really important is that that this is a really hard thing potentially to uproot, because again, it's white supremacy and whiteness, particularly for light-skinned folks or for folks who have the privilege of whiteness, or even selecting that as an option, right? So there's some really interesting sociological work that sort of shows how Latinx folks across generations are more likely to select their racial group as white, and to sort of that mejorando la raza, sort of that there's the option to become white in a society that's giving those that power and privilege. And that's what white means. It's not really the phenotype, but it's having the privilege in society to be able to move around and to have power. And for Latinx folks, you see that movement in terms of how they identify in terms of whiteness. So this is a really difficult thing potentially to challenge. And that for some people, it makes people really uncomfortable about their particular group. I remember working with someone from Brazil, and she's like, oh, in Brazil, we don't have any trouble with issues of race, and everyone is accepted for who they are, and we're just a culture all together, which, that wasn't my perception of how folks, and this was a light-skinned person, but it wasn't my perception of how darker-skinned folks in Brazil feel in terms of their inclusion into society and in the different places. So I think for a lot of people, particularly people who benefit from that privilege, is really difficult to do. And, even myself, like I'd never understood the history of mestizo. I thought that was like, yes, that's how I identify as this like multiracial person. And it really, when you look back and you learn the history, the term mestizo really came up again, as I said, to sort of say we're all together as one group, and denying sort of the indigenous folks that still had their own culture, had their own identity, had their own difficulties, and as well as African descendants who were in these Latin American cultures, and to say, hey, all of you don't matter, it's all of us together, and your different experiences due to your skin tone, due to your cultural history, due to are not as important as our unified sort of notion of race. And so I think that's a really important thing to think about. Yeah.
Sorry, on this slide, this challenge of uprooting, I think Alveli Alcantara shares a really good point. She says, I think the topic of colorism and race comes up more with my younger clients than with my older ones. The younger generation seems to be more aware about it and about deconstructing these cultural beliefs.
That's exactly right. So where a lot of this comes up, especially, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of social movements more broadly, is that it is harder for older folks. And so that they have more resistance to that, or that they just sort of, well, that's the way things are, that's the way things have operated. And sort of helping folks understand like who that benefits and how that benefits members of different societal groups can be really important. And we're going to talk a little bit in a bit about sort of critical consciousness and how as we work with folks, we can work to sort of support that. So the next example we have sort of, for example, if you had a darker skinned Latinx female sharing that she always has to look good, always wear her makeup and look the best because she's not as good looking as her lighter skinned sister. So she had to always sort of look good. So how would you address this clinically with your client? What are things that you might potentially do? So feel free to come into the chat and add some suggestions. I have some suggestions, but of course, these are the places in which you may ignore, you may not sort of address that, and might be really important to address, particularly how that family dynamic may play out. So one thing that's really important in terms of addressing clinically, and Juan, let me know when things come up since I don't have the comment box up.
Yeah, I wonder if you can go back to the previous slide just to keep that on there. And then if folks want to type in how they would respond to this, or if you feel brave, we'd love to hear your voices as well. So folks can also unmute and share their views. And I'm sorry, I know there are good discussions going on, but it's hard to keep track of all the chats as well. So I'll just share this. I'm not, go
Type.
ahead. Go ahead, Angela.
Thank you. Growing up in a very mixed Dominican family, with me thinking about this, that you're talking about the light skin versus the dark skin. Here in America, I'm considered light skin, but in my country, growing up with cousins with the blonde hair, the green eyes, I was the dark skinned girl. And I have curly hair. And growing up, I used to hate my curls. I used to always try everything I could to straighten my hair, do relaxer, just to fit in into that profile of beauty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that internalized piece, I think, is one of the important things to think around, sort of the things that we do to ourselves to fit into these standards that then are not are unfair and not right. But then at the same time, we buy into them because that's what we've been taught. If all the billboards around you, if all the TV shows, if everything you've has been consumed has really sort of focused on that, I think it can be really challenging to undo that for ourselves and to sort of find those folks that exemplify other ways that beauty is seen, and sort of find those. Like, you really have to work hard to do some of that work as families. Juan, is there another one, or should I move on?
Yeah. So some people, so Monet Davis shares, explore her thoughts about the contrast between she and her sister, explore how this has impacted her thoughts about herself, image. Mary Evers would want to know about the source of her for her feeling this way. And Sonia K says, ask open-ended questions to see what qualities they like about themselves, focus on them and not their sister. And we have a couple more. I would ask her what she thinks make her sister better looking first, or what is her own perception of being good looking. Yeah, so I think a lot of people just getting this person to explore, where do these standards come from, and why does she consider them that way?
Yeah, and I selected this example in part because there is sort of also standards of looking good as, Latinx women, and sort of what it means to have your face on and be out and presentable to the world. So there's sort of that intersection as well that sort of comes to, but where that drive comes from, I think, is an important part. So it's complicated in that, who are we to tell someone how they can or can't, what they should look like, or how much makeup they should put on or whatnot. But that motivation, sort of that little thing, is sort of saying something about this internalized perception of the beauty standards that then it might be important to explore, like people mentioned. So one thing that's really important for folks who are less aware of some of these things is sort of learning and reading. So in terms of how colorism impacts in different in societies, in different societies, it's different. So Angela, thank you for sharing, because, in Dominican culture, that's different than in Mexican culture, which is different than in El Salvador and Argentina, or in all these different countries. So really understanding in terms of your client and that particular group. In Brazil, these are all very different dynamics, and reading sort of how that has sort of what is specific in that particular group. The Nayeli Chavez Dueñas recommends sort of reading fiction books, and that really highlights sort of colorism and highlights sort of this experience for different folks. So there's a lot of books out there that can be really helpful. So just to really understand from different perspectives. One thing I think is that you could easily just let that go, right, and not explore it. But I think one thing that is really important, as people mentioned, is that probing and asking questions, asking for permission. So saying something like, with all due respect, why do some, and it depends, again, if you're Latinx versus not Latinx, but why do some of us Latino believe that darker Latinos are less attractive than lighter skinned Latinos? Who taught us to be prejudiced in this way? Where did these thoughts come from, right? Just like, let's explore. Or, it's painful for us to feel and to recognize that discrimination that exists, particularly if it's within your own family, right? If within your own family you were getting these messages, it can be really challenging to really think through. So I think one thing is sort of, one thing that's really important is not blaming anyone, or not saying, oh, your parents were, racist, and using these words that I think then make people defensive, but instead really thinking through together, like, wow, where do these standards come from? Let's think about this. You mentioned your sister's lighter skinned. Have you gotten messages that lighter skinned is more attractive in your family? Like, tell me a little bit more about where that comes from, right? So like really probing it explicitly, not just letting to see where the client takes it. because the client may not know that this is a comfortable thing for you to talk about with them. So I think really just explicitly addressing it is really important. And then really talk about this concept of internalized oppression that a lot of people are not familiar with, right? So that when these kinds of messages are given at society's level, we also internalize them. We also sort of believe them. We also then think through that those standards apply. And how do you sort of, and that this is not our fault, this is not anyone's fault, but how then you're letting that oppression sort of live inside you. And so how can you sort of be able to take it out and sort of question it and sort of take it outside of you and be able to say, no, this isn't okay. And I think one thing that's really important is finding role models and finding other narratives, other stories, other people that show beauty, that show sort of the idea of sort of what that looks like in a different way, historical figures that you may not know, like I was, that you may not know had, for example, African descendants, or that, or historic, or people in sort of that have had that this isn't something that just happened. So sort of similar as how people are now learning about the history of white supremacy in the United States in a way that maybe they weren't exposed to, like the Tulsa massacre, right? People may not have learned that in their history classes. So it takes an additional piece of learning, and so helping and inviting folks to learn that with you, to learn the history in their particular country of origin, or learn the history and finding role models for resistance, I think is really important.
Gabby, just real quick.
Yeah.
Sorry. Monet Davis is asking about books that folks can use to read or to give to clients as bibliotherapy. Alvali shared about the author Elizabeth Acevedo, who's a Dominican writer and writes fiction books for young adults. I know that we've used a lot this book here, which is Cultural Foundations and Interventions in Latino Mental Health. I guess it's more clinically driven, but it does go into some of the history of colorism and mestizaje and where the historical roots of these things are.
And they have an article that's free. I think it's available to anyone that talks about a particular case. Actually, they have a very similar case to the example I gave, and then they give different books as well. Juno Diaz is one. There's another one that they recommended that I'm blinking on. That I remember the author. It might have been Acevedo, but it was from another perspective. But yeah, so that I can send that article and people can.
We shared it. I think it's the 2016 one.
Oh yeah, that was it.
We shared it in the weeks leading up to the webinar. But Sophia, I wonder if you can track that down and put the link in for folks. But
yeah, and then they have recommendations in terms of some of the books that they recommend. Yeah, which can be really helpful. So I think when we think about colorism, the other piece in which is important to consider is anti-Blackness, and so how anti-Blackness sort of intersects with colorism in many ways. So if you remember that pyramid I first showed, African descendants were at the bottom of that pyramid, and so anti-Blackness is very much a sort of part of sort of Latinx sort of that hierarchy and how people sort of interact and interface with different racial groups. And it's something that I think is an important thing to consider. So I know that there's been a bit of a reckoning as folks have really thought about Black Lives Matter and the current social movements and sort of where do Latinx folks fit into this, right? So there's Afro-Latinx folks who Black Lives Matter literally are their lives matter, right? They're part of our community. So for other folks, sort of this idea, Latinos for Black lives, sort of their notion is that, oh, well, that doesn't apply to our group. So again, this mestizaje piece of sort of a sort of saying this is a separate group from us that we need to partner with. And so for some folks that are maybe more indigenous or have that, don't sort of identify as Black, but sort of recognizing that Black communities are part of our Latinx communities. And that's an important intersection that's important to think about. But at the same time, I love this drawing that was, I don't know if people saw it, shared on social media, which has this Frida Kahlo piece, is sort of this Black Lives Matter and no human is illegal, and sort of thinking about how our fights are connected as in terms of any movement for social justice, and where do folks fit into that. And I think particularly part of this is in communities in which there is sort of more anti-Blackness, and particularly not even just around anti-Blackness within the Latinx community, but maybe racism against African Americans and Black folks here in the United States, and stereotypes that exist about them. So I think one of the things that's really important to really think through is how then the work intersects, right? When we think about colorism, when we think about anti-Blackness, this is part of the larger system of white supremacy that we see in the community, and important to really think through how to help folks sort of engage in this social movement and see it as linked, as this linked lives, linked fate, because we know that that's actually something that can be really helpful for folks. So for example, something that can come up clinically could be something like a client shares that she avoids talking to her neighbor. This is a Latinx client, shares talking to her neighbor because they're Black and she doesn't want any trouble, right? So this like a passive sort of a microaggression, you could call it, or just, or aggression. I sort of don't love the term microaggression because any racism, nothing feels micro about it. It's all macroaggression. Sort of this, and so for many folks, you know, what do we do with that, right? So like, do you just let that go and just continue working with your client, or do you actually address what the client says? So one question we have for you is, how comfortable would you feel directly addressing this statement? So here's another poll to come up.
Can you repeat the statement?
Sure, I'll come back to it.
So it's a client shares that she avoids talking to her neighbors because they are Black and she doesn't want any trouble. Just thinking people might have the poll up and couldn't read it.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Juan. I just set it up. So really explicitly sort of saying, hey, you're saying something that's showing prejudice and racism and discrimination. So 40% of you, awesome, that would feel very comfortable. But as you can see, that's something that potentially is challenging to do, right? I do, when I teach around issues of sort of addressing race in the therapy room, one thing that is really important where people come up is, what is my role as their therapist to challenge their racism, right? What is my role here? Like, they're here to talk about their kid's behavioral issues. Their kid has ADHD, and they're wanting me to help them do some parent training or work with their kid around study skills or whatnot. So what is their sort of their discrimination, you know, against other groups? Is that even important? Is that even my role to address? And I will acknowledge that for myself, like, I was made uncomfortable by this and I didn't know how to handle it. And I would just be like, okay, I just need to, like, I disagree with what this person just said, but I don't know what my role is. And so for a long time, I also would stay quiet and not really think about how to say it because I didn't see it was central to their presenting problem, quote unquote, right? But, I think one thing that's really important is acknowledging that this isn't actually helping your clients, that this isn't helping your clients in any way. And one thing that is really important to think about is racism impacts not just the people who are sort of the subjects of that racism, the people who are experiencing that racism, but also the folks who espouse those racist beliefs, that they're just as harmful to them psychologically as they are to the people who are being exposed to the racism. That as a society, these are harmful beliefs for all of us, for anyone to hold. So I think to reach psychological health, you really want to think around how this is important to address. So one thing that I think is important is that language of addressing with curiosity, saying, oh, I wonder what you mean by saying you don't want any trouble. What are you worried would happen, right? And sort of explore that, or, and getting their permission, can we explore that a little bit? You sort of talk about these neighbors and you're worried about them. And if they don't explicitly say it's because they're Black, eventually saying, well, you mentioned that they were Black. Do you think that has something to do with it? Like, how do you perceive Black populations, and what are your worries and concerns? And then really exploring what it means to have that, sort of what it means to hold these beliefs and for a lot of folks that, if they particularly might say something, again, sort of stereotypical, like, oh, well, these folks are dangerous, right? Or it's not because they're Black, it's because they X, right? But really exploring sort of some of those, again, asking with curiosity and saying, well, what would it mean to not have relationships with your neighbors? Like, how does that impact you? And how does it impact your kids if they're sort of viewing a certain group of the population that's, with this mistrust, and how is that not helpful? We actually know that kids who have mistrust of other racial groups report less good psychological outcomes. So having these kinds of beliefs is actually going to harm their child. It's going to harm them, particularly around being able to adapt in a society that is multiracial, that is that we have a society where we have to interact with lots of folks. So one thing to really think around is how does this impact you to hold this belief? How does this impact your kid? How may this be harmful to you? In addition to sort of harmful to the folks if they're espousing actually racist behavior. And here we're just talking about, prejudiced beliefs. So how do these beliefs sort of impact your lives? And really thinking around the importance of living in a society that has folks from lots of different groups. And in my experience, when you engage in conversations in this way, people are more open to exploring them and thinking through them, where these beliefs came from and why they might have them. And something that had come up clinically, for example, is someone had a client that I was supervising the work with had experienced a shooting. The person was Latinx, identified by an African American person, and they were in a setting where there was majority African Americans around them, and sort of saying, well, I just don't feel safe. And it was part of sort of connected to that PTSD that this person was feeling. But it was really important to really think through, well, what is matters of safety? Is race a signal of safety, or are there other things that signal safety in a setting, right? It just may happen that everyone there, in that particular setting happen to be Black, but there's other ways that you can think about safety that are beyond race. And so really exploring, again, what are those pieces, and that if you're going to continue, if you live in any, for example, in Durham, and you feel unsafe around Black people, that's not healthy. That's not going to be helpful. That's not going to be good. So really thinking through and contextualizing what are ways in which thinking around those stereotypes and how they influence these perceptions of lack of safety, and how are the other ways that they can potentially really combat them and talk about them. So I don't know, I wanted to pause here and see what people sort of think, or any things people want to share around sort of addressing sort of some of this anti-Blackness. And I did want to come back to the comment that I forget the person's name shared about that across generations, this looks really different. So kids are maybe more likely, or I've worked with a lot of clients who will say, my parents are racist. My parents say these things. My parents don't want me to have Black friends. My parents don't want me to do this. And so really thinking through with the kid, where do these parents' beliefs come from? But then actually really addressing it and talking about it with the parents, I think, is a really important piece. And as a therapist, sort of using our position of privilege as therapists to or as an educator, or, I know there's lots of different folks in terms of para la mesita, but, using that privilege to sort of provide some of that information can be really important.
So yeah, folks can feel free to jump in and ask questions or chat them in. While people are typing, and I'm sorry, Gabby, I've been monitoring the chat, so sometimes I'm catching everything you're saying or not, so I apologize if you already said this. But I'm wondering about, and this is just anecdotal, there's no science behind what I'm saying, but equating the experience of discrimination and disenfranchisement that Latinx folks experience compared to what Black folks have to deal with, to create a sense of empathy. I don't know if you have any experience or thoughts on that.
No, definitely. Thank you for sharing that, because that was something I had meant to bring up. No, that definitely is I think can be a really useful thing. So I remember working with a kid once who told me that in their school, the teachers had said, they would say to the Black kids, oh, you should be more like the Latino kids pay attention. And so that they were really sort of pitting the groups against each other in a way that wasn't helpful, this particular teacher. And so talking with those kids around, or that kid around, well, who benefits from that infighting across different groups, and sort of really thinking around how white supremacy has really influenced and impacted communities of color, Black communities, and how it's the same sort of people that are separating kids and putting people in cages and letting people die in prison, that's the same system that's then also leading to George Floyd's murder, right? That's leading to Breonna Taylor's murder. So it's really thinking around how are these linked? And for my experience, again, a lot of folks, in the US, even people educated here don't know about the history of white supremacy to the extent of sort of the massacres that have happened, and the way in which white supremacy has been so insidious in terms of not letting Black people accumulate wealth, and through just different ways that policies have been enacting. So I think sort of sharing and educating can be something that can be really helpful as well. Because folks, so then as an immigrant comes in, they don't have that knowledge, and the kids do, right? The kids get some of this history, or they may learn it. And so having those conversations together can be really important. So yes, I think building empathy and talking about that can be really important.
Thank you. We have a comment from Krista Atkinson. How do I, as a white clinician, address the colorism in families that I witness in a culturally sensitive way? For example, when a mother calls a young child mi negrita, it seems like it is not my place to address this if it's not an issue that the client's bringing up. But I can also see how helping a mother to not perpetuate internalized oppression in her daughter can be helpful long-term for her daughter and for perpetuating colorism in general.
That's a great question, because again, it's not something you just witnessed, right? They just said it. It was a term of endearment. It really isn't meant in this sort of harmful way. So I think one thing that could be helpful is to ask that permission and to say, you know, I noticed you called your daughter mi negrita. Where did that come from? And then just explore with them a little bit and acknowledge, like, I know that, you know, I'm not Latina, but I've heard or I've read or I've talked to other families in which that impact of having that kind of language can be harmful sometimes because it makes them feel othered or it makes them feel different. So it's sort of leaning in on sort of leaning in a little bit on that, but acknowledging that you're coming from as an outsider, I think, and saying, I wonder how that might make her feel at some point, and what that might look like for her, particularly if there's, a big difference and if that comes to be an issue. But I do think it's important to potentially address, because again, I think it has this impact on kids and their experiences and how they perceive themselves. The other way you can come into it is through a conversation about racial and ethnic identity and thinking around the importance of feeling pride and feeling beauty, or the beauty standards might be another way to come in to sort of say, like, important to expose her to lots of different beauty standards. And I mean, I know from my mom, my mom used the term it really was a term of endearment. She did not mean any harm by it. It was based on a song she knew from when she was a kid about racial pride. And so it really, but I think when we've now talked about it with my mom's been able to be like, you're right, that probably wasn't good. And my mom is extremely light skinned. So, like, what does it mean for an extremely light skinned mom? So much so that people used to think my sister was adopted when they would go out in the world, because that's how different their skin tones was. So really helping them understand that, I think, can be really helpful. Is there another comment, Connor? Can I move on?
Just real quick, Whitney shares this is something that I've heard so many of my adolescents say too, adolescents that I work with. So Whitney Wilson says, a lot of times kids will say, I'm not racist, but X, Y, and Z person is Black, white, Asian.
Yeah.
They'll always preface it, and then they'll say, but this person is this race, and that comes with all of these other things.
Yeah.
And so she's saying it opens up the door for interesting conversations about our understanding of messages on race.
I think that's a really great point. And I think people use that all the time, is when they want to say something racist, they preface it by saying, I'm not racist. So I think that having that conversation of, like, if you felt the need to preface it well, why did you say, before you said that, why did you say you aren't racist? Right. And just even like, I'm curious, like, where did that come from? Like, oh, why did you think to preface that with that? Like, right. Because it's different to share that person, blah, 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 mistreated me. And then, but why did their race or ethnicity come into it? And then why do you think that means? And what does it mean to be racist? Like, I think that's the other thing, is to say, oh, well, what does it mean to be racist? Like, what's your, especially for teens, what's your perception of that? Because a lot of people think what racist means is like belonging to the KKK, right? Or something like that. And I think having some of that education can be really important.
And just a final one real quick. Jaylene shares, I've shared so much about US history in sessions with clients to address racism that comes up because folks often don't know about the dark US history in order to challenge racist thoughts, beliefs, and build empathy. An artist created an image that stated, el mismo racismo que nos deporta mató a George Floyd. The same racism that deports us killed George Floyd. And I think this is a great way of helping folks understand how realities intersect.
Yeah, I think that those kinds of images are like the image I showed. Like, I think showing those with kids and having a conversation, like, what do you think when you see this? Or what are your thoughts about this? Or how do you take this? Or what do you believe? I think it can be really important as well. So I think one thing I think it's important just to really,
No, you keep going, sorry.
Okay. So really committing to really what is one step you can take today learn more or to learn. I know that everyone's doing this and everyone's reading more, but particularly in working with the Latinx community, how is this a unique experience in the Latinx community? How is anti-Blackness sort of, how does it live in the Latinx community? And for those of us doing this work, really thinking like there's a lot of work that's like, as a white person, how can I be anti-racist? But I think it's important to really think through about anti-racism for everyone, and what does anti-racism mean in the context of the Latinx community, and having these conversations. And again, a lot of it is learning this history. So just like you would learn the dark history of the US, learning the dark history of Latin America, and learning some of those pieces to have that information to share can be really important. So we have also some ideas on how to build resilience, which we promised. So we spent a lot of time on the discrimination part, I think is really important. And I'm going to sort of acknowledge that myself, like, you know, I do research on discrimination, but I've always done the research as Latinx folks as targets of discrimination and not as sort of who's perpetuating the discrimination on others. And so the one thing I've decided as a step I'm taking on for myself is to really think about how can my research address some of these questions within our community. So I think all of us need to sort of work together to be active in this work. So one of the points of resilience is what do these social movements do, right? So this notion of critical civic engagement is something that's really been doing a lot of work, has been starting to come out, is sort of what does it mean to participate in a Black Lives Matter movement or the Dreamers movement or any sort of social justice movement, and how is that beneficial to the health and mental health of our communities? So one sort of this notion, it sort of comes again from sort of just critical consciousness and a lot of work that has been done in critical race theory and sort of work around sort of how we're aware of sort of systemic oppression. But I think it's a really useful, I love this is way to think about it in terms of what are ways that we can consider what the work that we do. So one of them in terms of what it entails to do critical civic engagement. Civic engagement typically is like things like voting or things like that, like participating in the political system. But the word critical is really important because it's sort of when you have a social justice lens to that engagement, and when you really think about what is my role in dismantling oppression and racism. So the 3 steps that are really important to facilitate critical civic engagement is the reflection, so knowledge. So all of these things that we're talking about, teaching the history, is really important to sort of that first step to being aware. And so for a lot of folks, they're not aware of that history. And so that's one of the first steps that we can take and really think around. What is the structural causes of social disparities, and how do they influence other folks? And this isn't just racism, it's also classism, sexism, heterosexism, so all the different ways in which oppression manifests itself in society. And so one of the things that's really important is really helping folks sort of move to that critical reflective space, because it's not something that happens naturally. And so what are the things that has to happen? And then political efficacy is sort of the ability or the belief that you can then impact something through activism. So can you, as a young person, can you as an undocumented person, can you do anything to impact this larger system? So if you just think, oh, this is a system that's oppressive, but then there's nothing I can do about it, that can be really challenging. So it's really important for folks to feel that there's things that they can do to change that system. And then that leads to the actions that you could then do. So what are the things that you can actually do to impact change and dismantle these systems? And so we know Latinx folks who have critical civic engagement, particularly, and most of this research won't be surprising, is done with teens and college students. But what we know for Latinx folks, that when they experience discrimination, if they have done more critical civic engagement, they actually are protected against some of the negative effects of discrimination. So they report better self-esteem, lower depressive symptoms, and more collective action, so that this prompts them to do more of this critical engagement and participate more in society. And what does this really look like? So one question we have for you is what percentage of the populations you service would you describe as critically civic engaged?
Have a poll coming up.
There we go.
I think we can publish.
So yeah, so the majority of folks aren't doing this kind of work, right? And particularly adults, right? And the question is, you know, when Juan and I were talking about this presentation today, where he's like, well, I would say none of my folks do this. So, but I don't know what to tell them to do. What can they do? How can they participate in this system? So one thing that's sort of important, just I'm sure you've seen in the news recently. So this is a Pew study, so that now folks have expressing much more support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And as you can see, the Hispanic population is a large percentage relative to other groups. So folks are really sort of, and this was a survey that was done from May to June this year. So there's a lot more support for this movement. So the question is like, well, how do I engage in different movements? And so I did think this was interesting to think about what is critical civic engagement. So this is, and this is again, the same survey that they did. So one is like even just talking with friends or family. So having conversations that sort of are teaching folks about this sort of systemic oppression, reaching out, challenging folks when they say something like, say something racist or say something that's prejudiced, that you say, hey, you just said that and that wasn't okay, or having those conversations can be really important. A lot of it you can see, and you can see here the percentages of Latinx folks relative to other groups, posting content on social networking sites or social media. As you can see for Black folks, that's a huge part, but again, 38% of Latinx folks are doing that, contributing money to an organization, contacting public officials, and then of course attending a protest or rally. So one thing that's important to recognize is sort of that critical civic engagement can be high risk or low risk, right? There's ways in which if you see the right now images from Portland, and if you see what's happening to these folks that are like out there protecting Black Lives Matter protesters, that's really dangerous what they're doing. You can be in jail, you can incur costs, you can get injured. So there is something to think around sort of the risk that you are facing if you're doing some critical civic engagement. And so one thing to think about with your clients is what do you might feel comfortable with doing, and what can you engage, particularly if you have some sort of vulnerability like being undocumented. Sort of what are the ways that you can do this in a way that's safe. One thing that was interesting is that research has shown, and this is Pew data that was collected in 2018, so a couple of years ago, that Hispanic folks and Black folks are much more likely to share, use social media to talk about their political views or this critical civic engagement. So one place in which, you know, everyone sort of Twitter is its own world, right? Or wherever that might be, or Facebook or whatever, or WhatsApp or whatever folks, people are using, or TikTok is now a place of a lot of critical civic engagement, right? So what are people using to share about these ideas? And one thing that I was surprised to know is that Latinx folks are more likely to do this than white folks and less likely than Black folks. So this is a place in which that they can potentially do some of that engagement. So one thing to really think about how we would do this clinically, again, is some of the teaching that you're already doing, but building that sense of efficacy, that there's things that you can do in partnership with other groups to build that. So one thing of why I think this is important, and the research, some research bears this out a little bit, is that connection with other people that are fighting the social justice together, that collective sort of can be really important, particularly in being in spaces in which that might be. So like, for example, religious or spiritual spaces, there's a lot of social justice spaces that are safe potentially. So that might be a place to go that people might feel comfortable going to. For example, something that's organized by a local church or a local pastor that builds that sense of efficacy, or that builds that sort of folks that are doing that kind of thing. Doing social media, having conversations, going to a protest if it's a safe protest versus a not safe protest, writing letters. Like there's, for example, the petitions that you can sign online that folks can do. So really thinking through what are things that they can do that are safe. And the reason to do this is that this does help folks feel better that when they experience discrimination, and feel less hopeless, and provide some sense of meaning. And we know from the research that this is actually a protective way in which folks can engage and feel less distress in terms of the current social climate and milieu. So this is something that I think is really important. Ethnic identity is also something that is really important to talk about. We've talked about this a lot when I've come to talk with y'all, so I'm not going to say a lot. But again, when you're fighting that colorism, when you're fighting that discrimination, really thinking around that pride, that biculturalism, sort of how they're connected to others and how they see themselves as part of a group. So again, thinking around that sort of what does it mean to be connected, and what other groups share that same plight can be really important. and then the values that in that particular racial ethnic group are important in terms of helping others. And again, a lot of these could have this religious bend that can be really helpful in connecting with others. So one thing that can be really important in building resilience to discrimination, again, is that connection and that feeling that that resistance that your racial group has experienced. So I think these are other lots of places. There's lots of ways in which resistance can be found. And I think one thing when we talk about the history, we don't want to just talk about the negative history. We also want to talk about the history of resistance. So history identifying people who have fought for social justice or who have tried to change the status quo. And again, in those Latin American countries, those heroes, or your own family's history of resistance can be really important. Again, sort of connecting to spiritual and faith communities. One thing that's really key in the Black church is a place when there was another Pew study that sort of say, does your church address social justice issues? And Black folks were the most likely to attend churches that did, relative to white folks, and Latinx folks were somewhere in the middle. But maybe this is a place in terms of finding a religious community that maybe would have that kind of, particularly in this current context. So if your religious community isn't providing you this kind of support, is there another community or another place that you can go that you can find that? And then why I think critical civic engagement can be so important is it's helping folks have meaning and purpose. So I think, again, connecting to meaning and purpose for folks is a good way to build resistance. And then one thing we know is talking with families about these experiences and peers can be really important. And so that's one of the things that helps folks who have these difficulties. And then finally, finding allies in your community. So who are the allies who can help you, and how is that work to do? And so for many folks who are here on the call who don't identify as Latinx, that being that ally can be really powerful, and showing that social advocacy and that voice, but also supporting the community can be really helpful. And we know that can really help dispel some of the sort of myths around discriminate, or well, not dispel myths, but more what I'm trying to say is just to say, well, there's folks out there that are fighting for good. There's not just folks out there that are doing bad, is a better way to put it. So that is all I had, and I did keep it to an hour, which I'm very proud of. But we really wanted to leave the last half hour for people to just have a conversation and ask questions. So feel free to either unmute yourself, put it in the chat box, talk about sort of some of these experiences about building the resilience, but also around colorism and anti-Blackness in the Latinx community.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, there's so much information in the chat box, and I feel like maybe my technology is not the greatest, but how do I go back, or can you all link us to an email of those resources or anything?
Yeah, so I think Sophia and I are collating those. So we're going to put a list of all the books and webinars that folks have shared. So yeah, we feel your pain in terms of scrolling through everything. I'm trying to keep up with it, but there's a lot, which is great. We love the engagement, but this is that opportunity for folks. If you didn't get to your comments earlier, if you can bring them up. I know several people talked about their family experiences, their own experiences about standards of beauty. So yeah, if you all feel comfortable, we'd love for you to unmute and share your views in particular, but also feel free to chat.
Hi, everybody. This is Liz Uzcategui with Clínica Latina. So one thing that I find powerful to do in sessions is to bring up pictures of dark skin models, light skin, all kinds of colors, because in what I'm trying to do with that is to say, like, you know, this is an opinion. All of this is opinion. What's beautiful, what's good looking, what's powerful or meaningful. A lot of that is opinion, and it's you know, based on our perspective of, you know, of course, what we've been taught and our own experiences, but it's all perspective and opinion. And so I've done this a lot with a lot of even African American females, because a lot of times they come in and they say, I'm too dark, I'm too black. Kids in the school are saying that I'm black. Even other black kids are saying they're black because they're so dark. but also with Latinas. Interestingly enough, with a lot of Latina adult females making comments of their, color, their skin color, and how they don't feel beautiful. So I just bring up those pictures of those models and I ask them, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great technique. I think that's really powerful and effective. I think the use of other media can be really helpful. Go ahead.
I'm done. Thank you.
No, I think that can be really helpful. It's interesting. They did a study in New York about sort of in the community there. I think it was in the Bronx. And what they found was the skin tone that was the most preferred was a light-skinned Puerto Rican skin tone. So that there was some color but that was the skin tone versus any sort of like Dominican or darker skin tone. But also whiteness was not privileged in that context. So having some sort of also thinking through in those different contexts what that skin tone would look like. So in that particular context in New York, that having some melanin was viewed as positive. So that was, I think, interesting to think around that context of where they live and what they're exposed to.
Sam, I think you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, just yesterday, working with a client, Gabby, a 12-year-old Latinx girl who is dealing with some low self-esteem around her appearance. We're working on an expressive project where she's creating kind of like comic book versions of different parts of herself. And within that comic application online, there are like multiple different skin tone options that she could choose from. And she's almost always choosing the lighter skin tones, certainly lighter than her actual skin tone. So thank you so much, because I feel like that's something that maybe would be good to explore with her explicitly in future sessions.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think the emoji skin tone thing is an interesting one, right? In terms of how you present yourself and how you see yourself and understand yourself. And in a comic book, I think is a really good, in some ways, like a really good avenue to have that conversation where you can sort of note that it is really important. And skin tone satisfaction, sort of how happy you are with your skin tone, definitely is something that predicts well-being as well in Latinx kids. We did a study here in North Carolina, and we found if you were dissatisfied with your skin tone, not surprisingly, you were more distressed. And so I think that's a really important thing to think around and how to build that. Other comments or questions?
Just had a comment, how interesting that it varies across Latin America as well. Like you were talking about the skin tone. And in Ecuador, at least like in the city where I live, which is close to the beach, like if you have a skin tone that it's versatile, meaning like it's light skin during winter months, and you can get really dark tan during summer months, it's definitely seen as more beautiful than other skin tones. And the same with like the hair. I was reading some comments about like curly hair not being as perceived as beautiful. In Ecuador, it's like if you have straight hair, they associate it with indigenous people. So it's kind of the opposite.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting thing to think through in different cultures and different countries, like to explore that and talk with them about that and the messages they got. And then the thing that also happens with immigration, right, is the kids aren't necessarily exposed to that in the home country. So they may not know where some of their parents' beliefs may be coming from, or maybe have never even traveled there. So they didn't sort of get to see that and see how it looks like. I think the other thing is that I think the intersection of skin tone and class, right, and social class, and what does that mean in terms of the social, like, right. And so I know that sort of assumptions that are made and stereotypes and around sort of social class that are associated with skin tone as well. So I think that's an important piece to sort of take apart as well and talk through with folks.
Gabby, I wonder if I can ask you actually to stop sharing. That way we can kind of see everybody in the same.
I was thinking of doing that, but then I didn't know if there was a reason I shouldn't do that. So yeah.
Yeah, I figure we've got all the information out there. But yeah, just to go off of Cecilia's point about having that versatile skin tone, and I forget, I just stuck in my head that someone mentioned a comment about there's some countries in which for just the summer months, the darker skin tone is seen as attractive. And then immediately it flips after that. So I don't know if that person is still on the call or.
That was me. So
Oh,
yeah,
that was you.
definitely summer months. You don't want to be as white, and people's like, estás toda blanquinosa, o estás verde, like with the plantain, when it's verde inside it's whiter, and when it's maduro it's darker. So yeah, that was me.
I think there's also, and I'm forgetting the baseball player because I don't follow baseball as much, but is it the Dominican baseball player who's like changed the skin tone? Angela, who is it? You're nodding.
I mean, Sosa.
Yeah. So I think that's another place where you can point to that, like what led to that, whatever he did. I don't know what he did to himself to make that happen. But I do think like that's another place that you can use as an example of how internalized that is and how it's not just for women, but also for men. Did you want to say something else about that?
Well, in my country, I cannot speak about everybody's culture, but in Dominican Republic, for some reason, our people do everything and create any nickname not to say and not to identify as Black. Morenito, Canelo, like all these names, and you are Black descendant. Just embrace your color, embrace your hair. And he is the prime example of what not being happy with your own skin look like. Because after he did whatever treatment he did, I mean, he looks like a ghost.
No, it's not attractive.
It's not even a pretty to look like that. So, and everybody, people that don't like the dark skin was making fun of him because what he did was, it was extreme. And unfortunately, there is a lot of women and a lot of men that would do anything to look a little lighter.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and thinking around those extremes, I think can be just even talking about that as an example and what does that mean and how what can you do to fight that narrative and even the language that you use. There's also a documentary, I have to find it, in which they went back to, it was teen girls in New York who were, did some like genetic ancestry thing. Did anyone see this with, she's a famous author. She wrote, I think her book was Birds of Paradise. Anyone know who this author is? Oh, someone's nodding, someone knows.
Yeah, Gabby, it's a great book, but I can find the author because it's a terrific book.
Yeah, so she did a documentary with Dominican girls in New York in which they did this, like, I'm not sure about the science behind this ancestry test. Like it was like your mother ancestor or whatever it was. And then they went back to the Dominican Republic and went around, and I'm pretty sure it was the Dominican Republic. But anyway, one of the things that was interesting is one of the girls, the genetic tracing was that she had African descendants, and she refused to believe it. She's like, that is not true. This is not like, and I don't think the film did as good of a job in addressing some of it. It's a very short film, but it was, and all of these girls were at risk for suicidality. They were girls that were having mental health difficulties, and sort of how that intersected with their racial identity and also sort of their understanding of their home culture. And so I think it also, that produces another one that could foster, again, some good conversations with clients about what does that mean to sort of think about yourself. And I think that even just how folks understand the genetic ancestries for folks that are starting to do those kinds of things, to understand sort of that diversity. Other questions or comments just about critical civic engagement or other pieces?
Yes, I would actually like to kind of tell my own experience and see your opinion about it and how to navigate that if seen in a client. So I'm Puerto Rican, which has like different ancestries, African, European, and Taino. And I've had experiences where I feel like I've been put in a box just based on my skin color. And to me, that feels like it's erasing my ancestry, which I'm very proud of. And I know I'm probably not the only one that has experienced this. So how would you navigate that if a client is experiencing that?
Can you just explain a little bit more what you mean by put in a box?
Just put in a box of like, you look white, like just like you look white, or you look, I've been told Middle Eastern, I've been told Indian. So it's kind of like erasing the other, other part of me that I'm proud of, that, my ancestry. So how would you navigate that with a client that comes to you with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing is the culture in which you're ascribed, right? That people believe, or your racial group that people perceive you as, versus the racial group in which you self-identify as, versus, your identity in terms of your ethnic identity, all don't align necessarily, right? Or and that I think in particular when there's that mismatch. So I know that there's some work, particularly in multiracial populations, on that, sort of in folks who are biracial, or what, depending on their phenotype, how people identify them, and sort of negotiating that constant questioning of your exotic. I've gotten that I'm Asian, half Asian. I was like, I don't even know where you got, so that sort of constant needing to sort of find who you are. And define that identity, I think, can be really challenging. And we know from some of the research, again, this has mostly been done, I feel like, with multiracial populations as opposed to other groups, that sort of call about these challenges, again, are sort of ways to think about internalized sort of, not internalized oppression, but the oppression that other folks are putting on you, and then how that fits into terms of your own racial identity. So it can be complicated. In terms of clinically how to handle it, I think one thing that is really important is building that foundation of your own sort of sense of identity, which it sounds like you really are proud and have. And so I think really centering it on your own sort of how that identity fits in, and then thinking around how you would want to have words to respond to other people when they have this exoticism of you, or this sort of othering of you. So I think one thing to really acknowledge is that I think folks that are racially ambiguous, I think this is why they do this work with multiracial populations, so that people don't know where to place them, is very confusing in a society that espouses mono-racism, sort of that the one drop rule, or that you can easily identify folks in a box and put them in a box. And so it's a larger societal structure that really is in the service of white supremacy, again, to sort of keep sort of the racial lines very neatly drawn to keep the caste system in place. So one thing you might talk with your clients about is sort of that, why that happens, and why it's really interesting when they look at research in Europe versus the US. There's very different ways that folks look at other groups, multiracial faces, and it's really the US that has a really weird way that they do it relative to other groups, and it's primarily white people that do it relative to other groups. So that it's important to sort of acknowledge that this is part of sort of how white supremacy is in the lived experience, and then giving folks language. And when people say that, to say like, no, my racial group, to either say, why do you ask that, or why do you assume that, or to just have someone be able to say what they feel in the moment. I don't know if anyone else has any other suggestions.
Thank you, that was very helpful.
Angela, go ahead.
Just want to say that I found myself in the same situation a lot. I live in a small town, so the majority of the people here are Black, and they always question me, like, but you brown, how are you Latina, how are you Dominican? And I feel that I agree 100% with what Ms. Gabriela was saying. I think we have to accept ourselves first, understand our backgrounds to be able to share it with others. Because I always explain to them, just like the United States have white Europeans, they have the Indian Native Americans, and you have the Black became slaves. We have the same background. The only difference is Spaniards came to our country. That's why we speak Spanish. But we have white Dominicans. We have Dominicans that look more like Indians, and we have Black Dominicans. So we have all three races in our background as well. And that gives them a little bit more understanding why I have a brother that is very light skinned. So why he looks the way he looks, why I look the way I look.
And I think sort of talking about the history of enslavement, I think that there has been sort of that denial of that enslavement that happened, particularly in Brazil, but in all of Latin America, in which where those that history is really significant. I think people have an assumption of what Latinx. I remember I was like I told you, my mom was really light skinned, and I'm light skinned as well. We were speaking in Spanish in Duke in a waiting room, and someone's like, "What language are you speaking? It's so exotic." We're like, literally like Spanish, right? But because phenotypically they're not what they phenotypically ascribe to what someone who speaks Spanish looks like, right? Or what they thought that would look like, and it really was this idea that what that. So I think it's a really important piece to sort of acknowledge sort of how people other others and sort of that they don't allow the diversity that exists. So one thing, there was a really cool, and I've tried to find it again, but CNN did a thing of like the diversity of the Latino population where they had folks from lots of different racial groups and pictures around the diversity. Because I think giving those images, I think can be really helpful too, to sharing with folks.
Johnson Brano, I just want to add to that. I could relate to the lady that just spoke right now about how people sometimes jump into conclusion, because I work in a Marine Corps Air Station. I was here in '92, and there was the Mexican population was there, but I was the only Ecuadorian. And ever since I come back about 10, 20 years, I work with my colleagues. A lot of them are Caucasian. There's a couple. The minority where I work is very little, and all of my colleagues used to think that I was Mexican right off the bat, color, skin, whatever. And what I did is I didn't get mad. I used the opportunity to educate the difference between, like she said, there's in the Spanish Latino community, there's so many variety. And once I started educating them between the difference between Hispanic, Latino, and all that stuff, they were amazed that even an Ecuadorian is different from a Mexican or somebody from the Caribbean, and they like that, and they weren't aware of that. Mm-hmm. So I guess education and not being offended, I think is the key to, getting everybody to understand that there's a big population up there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bring up a really important point, which is sort of that notion, not even just racially, is that then people are ascribed to an ethnic group because they're Latinx, that, that you have to be of the group that is the primary, right? So like in New York, you're not Mexican, you might be Puerto Rican or Dominican or whatever, right? And in, Florida, you might be Cuban or whatever it might be. So that depending on what group has the largest sort of country of origin, then people assume all Latinx folks have that particular perspectives. I think that's a really important piece too, in terms of that education and helping folks understand what do you like, when you think around identity, there's some research to suggest that identity that's tied to country of origin is most protective. So if you identify as Mexican American as opposed to identifying as Latinx, that's actually, there's a protective, and people really don't understand in the literature why, but part of it is because maybe you're more wedded to that culture of origin. And when you identify as Latinx, that has more of a racialized kind of oppressive kind of like a shared group. So one thing to really share is like, what does that Latinx identity mean? Does it mean sharing an oppressive experience, or does it mean sharing a language, sharing a culture, sharing, what do you see that you have in common with, Mexicans and Ecuadorians and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans? And what do we have in common as a people besides the experience of potential oppression, which if that's the only thing that links us as a group, then that's probably not a very protective linking mechanism. So really focusing on what that means, again, building those bridges and really thinking through what does it mean to identify as Latino versus Mexican American or whatever that might be for the particular group, which I think is an important discussion to have with clients, because that's I've been shown to have different effects and impact on them.
Alveli, I saw you typed a really great comment. I'm happy to read it, but I'd rather not speak for you if you feel comfortable sharing, but if not, I'll read it.
Yeah, so I was born in the Dominican Republic, but I was raised in New York City. But in New York City, I was often told I was too white, too light-skinned to be Dominican. So I was often told I was Puerto Rican. And then when I moved here to the South, it was also trying to figure out where do I fit in, because it was either I was exotic looking or Mexican or Middle Eastern. Mm-hmm. And then when I go to the Dominican Republic, I'm too white for the Dominican Republic. So it's like I grew up with this idea of where do I fit? Ni de aquí, ni de allá. Like I'm not from there, I'm not from here. Mm-hmm. And so trying to figure out, well, where do I belong? And I realized that it's a topic that shows up a lot with like my younger generation clients, where they're also trying to figure out where do I fit in. And so it's a lot of identity work on what do you identify as, and what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I think that, and I think especially those pieces in which different cultures, like, you know, that you don't fit in any of them. And so then if you add a layer of that acculturation, not just phenotype or what, but also then like, what does that mean if you grew up in a certain place, or do you get to claim that as your heritage? And, you know, ultimately you should be able to claim whatever, you know, that's a personal thing that other people can't ascribe to that for you. And really thinking through like what makes different groups do that, and who benefits from that system in that place, and then what does it mean that we want to neatly categorize people into these groups, and I think is a really important conversation to have. So thank you for sharing. I think that's exactly the piece, and it's across race, across acculturation, across country of origin. And I really want to go back to the comment someone else said about what it means when we use the term Americano, because again, it always is a euphemism for white, and we have to get away from doing that, because that then negates the Americanness of everyone who shares that identity. So I really think it's an important, and it's really hard to do, but like even if someone says, say, hey, you know, why do you use that term for white people? Should we say something else, or you know, use another term? I think it's a really important, just even challenging that term, I think is helpful for people's identity, because again, the language that we use is really important.
Just want to share a couple things real quick. There's a lot of PR pride in the chat. And I think a lot of people really identified with your experience, Alvili, and they're really grateful for you sharing that. So thank you. But just real quick, Sophia asked, can people talk about concrete ways to do the identity work? I wonder if you have any ideas for folks, Gabby.
Yeah, so one thing when you think about identity, particularly with, so it depends on what age, but the notion of exploration, right? So getting to know more about your identity is a really key construct. So we think about identity in two different ways, from a social identity perspective and from a developmental perspective. And so from a developmental perspective, there's sort of this notion of exploring that and learning about what that is, and sort of really thinking around like, what is the history of the group that you're from? Where are you from? Learning about that group that you may or may not have that knowledge. What's that experience of that group in the United States? So the exploration is really learning what are the values of the group that you like learn and think about when you think about what it means to be, let's say, Puerto Rican. Since we're going with Puerto Rican pride, what does that mean to you? What are you proud of about being Puerto Rican? What are the values that you espouse, and what are the values that maybe you don't like about your group? What are things that you wish were different in your group? So one of those pieces is really doing that exploration work, which really is around learning the traditions and the history. A lot of folks really talk about interviewing older people, interviewing grandparents or tios or tias about their experiences and learning about their group, particularly if they're not in the home country, right? What was it like in that home country? And having those connections can be really helpful. Because what really can be challenging is if you're, particularly as an immigrant, like you may not know the history of the Chicano movement in the United States, right? So you have it, like you learn about the history of your home country, but then there's also that exploration. So one piece is just really just learning more about the group here in the United States and the group back in the home country is really important. So when we think about identity from a social identity perspective, we also have sort of this notion of what's called centrality. So how central is that part to how you identify yourself? So is it something that so a really simple exercise to ask someone to do is to say, I am, right? So what do they write? I am a, woman, I am a mom, I am a this, and seeing where ethnic and racial identity come into that, right? I'm a Black, Dominican, American, right? So all the different places in which those could connect, and then thinking around what those are and sort of how central to your defining feature is your racial identity group, and how much does it impact sort of how you move around. So doing that work is really thinking through that different parts of your identity. So doing some activities that are around like sort of putting yourself together and how you consider yourself and what are the different places. The other thing that you can do from a social justice perspective is thinking around the different axes of oppression that exist. And so privileged membership. So in terms of like, for example, sexual orientation, gender identity, country, like immigrant status, there's educational status, accent. So there's lots that you can do that you can help people sort of see where do you fit in and where do you have aspects of privilege and where do you have aspects of oppression can be really helpful in terms of some of the identity work. And then finally, pride is the big piece. So you need the exploration to have the pride. So you need to know what, again, the resistance and the history of that group to sort of feel connected to other members from that group is really important. So doing things with that members of other groups to feel connected and then having that pride in that group membership. So again, that learning can be really helpful. Role models can be really helpful for that. Reading books, learning, I think is a really important way that teens can do movies, things like that can be really helpful. I don't know if anyone else in our last minute has another suggestion.
Yeah, I was gonna unfortunately bring us to a close. Just I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I appreciate everyone. We have had a few folks chime in that they've appreciated this extra time for the Q&A. I know I've appreciated it, just as far as, first of all, not being stressed to get through the presentation, and we can have more interaction during the presentation. I thought that was really nice. And I think having this space, I mean, we always say we want to make these things interactive, but sometimes within that 1 hour, it's really difficult. So really love and appreciate everyone's support and your feedback, and for jumping in on this conversation today, and for being willing to stick around for an hour and a half for these really important conversations.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for coming. And if there's any questions, feel free to reach out. It was lovely.
So we'll just wrap up with a couple of housekeeping points. Sophia, I wonder if you can put that, or you probably already did, the survey. Thank you. So if you can take some time to fill out that survey, it really helps us to keep La Mesita going, and also just to create good impacts at the policy level, to help to bridge these gaps in service and how much the Latinx community is being impacted. So please take about 5 minutes, complete that for us. I would really appreciate it. Also, want to encourage everyone to mark your calendars for next month. We'll have a presentation by Dr. Irma Corral from ECU, who will be presenting on tobacco and e-cigarette use among Latinos and how they are particularly targeted by these industries and what we can do to help that. So that will be Friday, August the 28th from 10 to 11:30. So moving forward, keep in mind, we're doing these hour and a half. We want to have your voices in here, and that extra half hour just makes all the difference. Today was our first one, and I'm just so happy that it allowed for this great conversation that we just had. So with that, I want to say big thank you. Big thank you for Gabby for allowing us to rope you in for a second time.
Happy to do.
But I think it was like what you said at the top, Gabby, we had this is a huge topic. We didn't even get through everything today. Obviously, this is something that just needs to be an ongoing conversation, but we're so grateful to have your time for a second time in a row, and this time for an hour and a half. So thank you so much, Gabby. And yeah, thank you, all of you, for coming. Please consider joining our La Mesita network if you haven't. Just go to la-mesita.mn.co, create a profile, we'll admit you immediately, and then you can stay up to date with all of our programming and webinars and other learning opportunities. So with that, I'll say thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you, Gabby, and take care, everyone. Stay safe. We'll see you at the next one.